Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the post 104, the research gap. This is a brilliant request. What makes research research? What makes a PhD a PhD? And the answer to both those questions is an understanding of the research gap. Now, I'm well aware in research, particularly in doctoral education, we throw around stuff like the SOC, the research gap, like it's always existed. And that's not true. Research changes. The language we use to understand research also transforms through time. So these days I know we sort of throw around the SOC, and we discuss with great intensity the research gap, like we all agree and know what those words and phrases mean, and that's simply not the case. This post this week, I've received 22 requests for this particular topic in the last 3 months, so something must be going on. And also, and this does upset me a little bit, every single one of those remarkable humans have said to me, can they be anonymous? Because they're embarrassed. And I'll just give you one little extract from one of the emails I've received. Quote, "Everyone talks about the research gap. It is embarrassing to admit that I have no idea what they're talking about." End of quote. Never be embarrassed. Never be embarrassed. Remember, the whole point where we started all these vlog series, and remember, we're heading to 500. The reason they existed is so that you and I can have a little quiet chat. You can put on headphones while you're at the gym or going for a walk, or you can sit and watch the video while you're in the kitchen making a meal. And no one has to know that we're having this conversation. But in 30 minutes, you will know something. You will know something about the research gap, and you'll be able to use that phrase with some dexterity and some clarity. Now, the gap, mind the gap, research gaps matter, but they can also mask as much as they reveal. So to build the post this week, we've got some fantastic transformational scaffolded research. So we've got firstly the research from A. Anthony Miles, then we've got Robinson, Saldahier and McCoy, fantastic article, and Muller, Bloch, Krantz. Fantastic research here. And as always, and this one's really important, you know, I always put a reference list at the end of the posts so that you can go to it and use it. This one really matters. If you are able to work with and cite these 3 articles, I think I've got about 30 references at the end of this one, but if you can work with these 3 articles, if you can put them into your thesis, put them into your research article or your scholarly monograph, they will help you frame and shape and organise. They are that good, they are that important. Now, just a reminder, and this is crucial, and I think this is where people get frightened and worried and confused, right? There is this assumption that a research gap is one thing and we can talk about it with ease. Actually, that's rubbish. It's rubbish. A research gap is many things. It's not a singular entity. There are lots of different ways of understanding the gap, framing the gap, and applying it in your research. So, for a research project to be developed, particularly in doctoral education, a gap has to be specified, spoken about, and taken for a walk. Now, too often in doctoral education, a research gap is a vibe. I wish I was joking. So this is my research gap. And of course I go to my computer and I find about 35,000 articles in that gap that they think nothing exists there, right? So what often happens, particularly in the early stages of doctoral education, is a student is confident, and we need students confident, that's tremendous. But you see, a student hasn't read enough, and because they haven't read enough, they see a gap everywhere because, quoting myself, we don't know what we don't know. So research gaps too often are subjective. They're reliant on scope, they're reliant on bias, and they're reliant on subjectivity. So way too often a research gap is a subjective entity. Now, it's also increasingly difficult to both locate and secure a gap because of the diversity of research literature and the scope and scale of research literature. Remember, we're in times of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and post-disciplinarity. So what this means is something today may be new for social work, but it was talked about in great detail in criminology in 1999 and talked about in great detail in cultural studies in 1984. Okay? We also have to manage what's described as publication bias. What that means is journals publish articles with positive outcomes. So the null or the negative results tend to not get published. But there's also a linguistic and geographical bias as well. So you might go, I have found a gap, whereas actually 15 remarkable scholars have already filled that gap, but they've written in French and you can't read French. Okay, so that's the linguistic bias. But also the accessibility of literature, the cost of particular journals. Now, you know, that's why platinum open access all the way, every day. That's what we do. But because of the prohibitive cost, the corporatization of academic journals, an article may be there, but because of the cost of that journal and that article, you haven't read it. Okay, so the researcher's positionality matters a great deal here. And when we're thinking about the gap, the first thing we have to do is take on board and really understand, team, our own assumptions, our own biases, our own histories, our own subjectivities. And we have to deploy rigor here. What we think is not terribly relevant. What we need to find out is there a legitimate gap here? Not just a vibe or what I think, what I feel is a gap. Our literature searches must be systematic and most importantly, repeatable. So yes, do that systematic presentation and engagement with databases and use clear and repeatable search criteria. So we are talking about, literature reviews, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and what we're trying to aim for is completeness, transparency, and accountability. That's what research is. Now, you know this, I've talked about this a lot. We're seeing a lot of systematic reviews in a lot of research areas, particularly I would argue in allied health, and we're seeing systematic reviews constructed, okay, and very weird parameters are constructed. So very, very strange parameters are being constructed in the systematic review. And you know what? Because of the weird parameters that have been constructed, magically we find that only 7 articles have appeared in the history of the world on this topic. Yeah, right. What we're trying to locate is a meaningful gap. What I'm trying to do is render your research credible and to provide a strong and clear shape, structure, and framework around it. Too often, way too often these days, the gap is in the eye of the beholder. So what I want to do is make the gap real, not simply the perception of a gap. Don't assume the gap, confirm the gap. Okay, that's it. Now, let's talk about the different types of gaps that exist. And can I say wonderfully, and this is the great gift of international research, the taxonomy of research gaps has emerged and is beautiful. And that's happened in the last 15 years. So great scholars have really gone in there and I am so thankful to them. I'm going to talk a little bit about them now. So the first taxonomy came from Robinson, Sandahere and McCoy, and that was in 2011. Now, they located 5 types of gaps, and this was great work, can I say? Remember, a long time ago now, 2011, 5 gaps. Population, intervention, comparison, outcomes, setting. Amazing. We then moved to Muller, Bloch and Kranz from 2014. Brilliant. And they configured a really remarkable research project here, intensified the previous study, rendered it more sophisticated, but of course someone has to do the first taxonomy to make the next one better, and that's certainly what they've done. Now they located 6 different types of research gaps. These are crucial. Let's do them properly. Methodological conflict, contradictory evidence, knowledge void, action, knowledge, conflict, crucial one that, evaluation void, theory application void. Absolutely brilliant. Now, to explain how we're going to work with those 2 taxonomies, D. Anthony Miles did a synthesis of these 2 models in 2017 and has created what I would argue is the best way to think about and apply the research gap. And can I say, 10 minutes before I started this vlog, very early in the morning, Miles' piece has already received 446 citations. So a lot of people are using this and taking this taxonomy for a walk. Let's do the same. So Miles configured a taxonomy of 7 research gaps, 7 different types of research gaps. Let's do them. Evidence gap, knowledge gap, practical knowledge conflict gap, methodological gap, empirical gap, theoretical gap, and population gap. That taxonomy will change our lives. So this is such a strong taxonomy because most disciplines, and of course in our community, our online community, we have every discipline represented, about 100 nations represented, so we've got a huge amount of diversity here. But the reason I'm going forward with this Miles taxonomy is whatever your discipline and your paradigm and your theoretical perspective, there will be a way to configure a gap in and through this work. You can build a thesis around Miles's taxonomy. I'm writing, I think, 6 pieces at the moment, and I've taken on board this taxonomy and it is altering how I am writing these pieces. So this is important. So let's now go through this taxonomy so you have an understanding of the different types of research gaps. Let's do this. The first one was, as you might remember, the evidence gap. This is pretty straightforward. So what happens is an exception arises where we've got evidence that contradicts previous findings. Okay, so this is where knowledge is. We all agree on that. That's great. And then this little evidential pod emerges that is different from where knowledge is. So this gap is constructed through a conflict between this little pod of evidence and where we have agreed knowledge exists. So once contradictory evidence is located, research can then be investigated and we assess the contradictory evidence. Wow, can we in any way synthesize it with previous knowledge, or is this something radically transformative? So this way of thinking about a gap is incredibly common in the experimental sciences, okay? So a new data set emerges that's dissonant with earlier research and we have to do something about that. Great stuff. The second gap is the knowledge gap. Now, too often in the past, the knowledge gap was configured as the only gap that existed. And actually, there are 2 types of knowledge gap as well. So let's get into that. Basically, a knowledge gap discusses how desired findings on a particular topic are not available. So we need evidence on a particular issue and it does not exist. So let's use an example. Say we want to find out about the attrition rate of PhD students who are neurodiverse. What is the attrition rate of neurodiverse students in their first year of candidature? We don't know about that, right? So that is a knowledge gap. Excellent, fantastic. But there's another type of knowledge gap that exists as well. So the result of the study is different from what we expected. So this is a different type of knowledge gap that, okay, we thought it would be this, and oh, it's not. Let me follow that example through. So in our study of PhD students who are neurodiverse, we found that, and this is probably quite likely to be frank, someone should do this study, that neurodiverse students in the first year of their candidature actually have a lower attrition rate than inverted commas neurotypical. And by the way, I hate this binary, but let's go with it. So, right, they've got a lower attrition rate. Unexpected. We've now got a knowledge gap to work out why that is the case. Okay, knowledge gap. This is the one I love. Let's move to the practical knowledge gap. Oh, this is huge. This is so exciting for so many disciplines. So a discrepancy can motivate new research. So we call this a practical knowledge or an action knowledge conflict. Let me explain. So the actual behaviour of professionals in particular fields is different from their advocated behaviour. Let me explain. So researchers see a scope and scale. This is what a profession is meant to do, and this is what the professionals in the field are actually doing. So why is that the case? Now, this mode of gap, oh my goodness me, is crucial for, let's do it, education researchers, social work researchers, and allied health professionals. Right, let's use an example. So say we've got in one nation on this planet a National Association for Physiotherapy, and they have particular guidelines and codes of conduct, right? And that's what the organisation is organising. That's the framework. And yet the professionals in the field are not abiding by this professional mandate. So there's a conflict between knowledge and behaviour, knowledge and action. Now, for prof docs, hi to everyone doing a prof doc out there, for any sort of applied research, this gap is so meaningful and so important. Let's go to the next one, methodological gap. Right. So this gap deals with the conflict that occurs due to the influence of methodology on research outcomes. And you've heard me talk about this for the last 10 years. So what happens is in some disciplines, one specific methodology is used over and over again. And remember, when you select a methodology, you also select your outcomes. When you select a methodology, you select the evidence that you're not going to find. So there is an argument that, okay, we've used this method. What if we use a different method and we gather different types of data sets? So a gap is created, and I love this one, when we address the reification of research methods in prior studies. So we decide, you know what, I'm going to make a different methodological decision from what is accustomed in my discipline. Now, this is a strong area to consider, particularly in the applied social sciences and allied health. So it's a great way to discover something new, to simply choose a different method, get different data sets, and have a different way of thinking. Because a variation of methods not only can generate new insights, but can reveal previous distortions. So for example, I often talk about, you know this, I often talk about unobtrusive research methods and the value that they hold in contemporary life. My argument is, why exactly do we need new information at this point? Why do you think that it's so important that we talk to 20 people, or we do a survey of 50 people and get new data? Don't you think there are multiple studies around the world that have already done that work and are available for fresh and innovative interpretation? Why do we always think that new knowledge is a new data set? Okay, so a different methodology can reveal a different data set and a different way of thinking. Okay, let's do the empirical gap. This deals with the gap that we find in knowledge where we've got a maxim or a theorem or a thesis that exists, a hypothesis if you will, but it needs to be empirically verified. Okay, so an argument can exist. We got a sense this is what's sort of occurring, and you may be right, but we require empirical methods to see whether or not that mantra or idea is accurate, right? So it's an empirical gap. So as researchers, we offer a theory, a vibe, a bunch of ideas, but a gap can be filled by finding evidence that either agrees with that maxim or discounts it. Let's go to the theoretical gap. So something, an event, an entity is explained through theoretical models. But there may be a theoretical conflict between two or more models. Which one is superior? And so there's a gap that exists between here's the theory, here's another theory, there's the gap. Let's understand these theories and see what's operating in that middle space. Now, please remember the word theory, capital T, little t, is used radically differently in different disciplines. But let me give you an example from my sort of disciplines. So we've talked about it a lot, I've written about it a lot, Baudrillard's theory of the double refusal. So this is the refusal of a leader to lead because they're incompetent, the refusal of a leader to lead, and the refusal of people to follow that leader. So the leader doesn't lead, people don't follow them, the double refusal. Baudrillard's double refusal. Great, that's a theory. But a theoretical gap exists, seeing if particular models of leadership are more likely to lead into that double refusal. So, for example, here's an actual theory, and I'm really interested, so I might actually do this work after having come up with this example for you. But for example, we have charismatic models of leadership in leadership theory, charismatic models. Now, I'm interested, do charismatic models, are they more likely to lead to incompetent leaders that lead to the double refusal? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. That is a theoretical gap. Let's do the population gap. This is a great one. So an underserviced population is also under-researched. So we have the evidence base for all sorts of populations, but there are blind spots. We could call it discrimination on the basis of age or gender or sexuality or race or disability or impairment, right? So this is a population gap. So let's again use an example. We have a lot of research on work, the sociology of work. But we don't have a lot of research on the sociology of work on people with invisible disabilities. So the sunflower community. So if you've got an invisible disability, what happens to the sociology of work? That is a population gap. Plenty of research in an area, but one population group is underserviced. So I'll give you one example that we all know about, and a lot of us are living in higher education. We talk a great deal about doctoral education and doctoral students. Too many assumptions, and of course they're now just completely wrong. Assume that a PhD student is 23 to 25 years of age. Now, what happens to the older students over 60, over 70? That is a population gap. And we're filling that gap through, say, yes, surveys and interviews, the basic stuff, but also personal testimony and learning-led research. Great. So the profound gift, so they're the gaps. See, diverse, amazing. So the profound gift of research is to be able to identify a gap, to describe it, and to configure strategies to fill that gap. To identify a gap, though, requires a really strong understanding, not a vibe, a strong understanding of previous research, and that can be a literature review, systematic review, scoping review. But you see, the best research, and this is, if you get nothing else out of today, I hope this is useful. The best research can also describe why the gap exists. You see, what is the gap is fine. How we fill the gap, that's fine. But why the gap existed in the first place is a crucial question. What do we learn about the state of knowledge through the existence of this gap? Being able to present rather than ignore, rather than mask the inconsistencies and the controversies in knowledge is the first step in a more ethical way of thinking about information. Now, there may be lots of controversies in your fields, most fields have them, but there also might be blind spots. Ask why. Why are there particular blind spots in particular disciplines? So gaps in knowledge can reveal that something pretty weird is happening. Now, my former boss, the legendary Rob always, he did so many amazing things. He's a brilliant guy, but he always used to trigger me and trigger colleagues around him to think about research in a different way. And he'd do it by one question: what changed? So, okay, we're here, we're about to investigate this research project. What's changed to make this relevant today? So being able to specify and understand the change is a way to engage with a gap. Therefore, to locate a gap requires a really clear understanding of what the hell you are doing here. What is your contribution? And why is it important that we revisit, we revise the state of knowledge? You see, we have to be respectful of the gap. We have to mind the gap. And that drive towards new knowledge and answering big questions must also be based on intellectual generosity, understanding the work of the past. The arrogance, I think, is what upsets me a lot. So, like, tens of thousands of the greatest minds in history have investigated this topic, and you just magically discount all of that and go, yeah, well, they're rubbish. Let me tell you what I feel. Yeah, nah. Now, Adolf Karabanga argued that when we probe a research gap, we configure a research link. Now, I love that. So if you think about research as a necklace, a very nice necklace, that something's disconnected. So what you're doing is you are making a link to render the necklace complete. You are finding a research link. Research, of course, includes a lot of cliches, a lot of assumptions, and I think all of this is getting a bit worse now, I think, with the focus on research training. It's so reified, it's so simplistic, and actually research is elegant. It's not dumbed down, it's not a series of basic ideas, it's elegant and it's dynamic. And one of the problems, I think, is at the moment, the word research in our universities is sort of getting stuck to the word innovation. Research, innovation, research and innovation. Now, what is innovation? And does innovation require research to enact it? I would separate out these words. But think about all the words that are bubbling around university research at the moment. Discover, invent, innovate, transform, disrupt. What do these words really mean? And look, they're dominating strategic plans and vision statements. Has anyone actually unpicked these words to understand what they mean? How do we discover? How do we invent? How do we transform? Remember, 5.14 million academic articles are published each year. So assuming that a gap's easy to find and you're the centre of the universe and you're the person to fill that gap, that's just madness. That's madness. But you see, the gift of focusing on research gaps like we are doing today is that we're also challenging disciplinary boundaries, and we are, I hope, enabling a post-disciplinary future. You see, what we're doing is I want innovation with research methods, stopping the endless surveys and interviews. What are you doing? I'm doing surveys and interviews. What are you doing? I'm doing grounded theory. Are you? Great. Now, consider how your research can be disseminated, but also how research can be democratized. It is important to remember that the research gap and the conceptualization of the research gap came from the experimental sciences. So this is important. That's why we need the diversity, because so many of our assumptions about the gap came from a very finite group of disciplines. So remember that knowledge has a history. Knowledge changes. If you think about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient China, they gifted us the power of observation of the natural world and human behaviour. Astonishing. Through the Renaissance, through Copernicus, through Galileo, through Da Vinci, that's where we started to see, oh right, there's a gap in our observations, so let's enact empirical investigations to fill the gap, right? Then we hit the scientific revolutions of the 17th and the 18th century, empirical inquiry, rationalism, Newton, or more appropriately Hooke, but also René Descartes. The 19th century, the 20th century, this is where the specialist disciplines started to emerge, and I would also argue the disciplinary gatekeepers started to emerge. This is the way that you organise research literature, and this is where we start to have this formalised knowledge generation process. Literature reviews, synthesising existing knowledge, research questions, hypothesis. Boof, 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 ta. But our century is doing some really interesting stuff to this, with interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and post-disciplinarity. We are developing new perspectives, and we are creating a different dance between ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Yeah. So we are living in an incredible time of these large online databases, open access research, multimodality, multimodal research. But we're also living in chaotic times, colleagues, for our universities. Threatened research funding, in fact, that's not even strong enough. Destroyed research funding. And political interventions from #randoms telling us what's appropriate to research. Yeah, right. But even in such times, I still believe it is important that we justify the research that we are doing. We show how we are solving problems. What changed? Answer that question. As Ilyas Muhammad has confirmed, and I love this quote, understanding knowledge gaps is crucial for understanding where our research can make a meaningful contribution. End of quote. Brilliant, meaningful contribution. This is not about the sciences over the arts. It has never been. And this has never been about the empirical versus the theoretical. It has never been thus. This instead is how we render research meaningful, how our ideas matter, and understanding that research gap with precision, with clarity, but also with honesty. This is a powerful moment in walking towards research that matters. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.